Hi, I'm Iain and welcome back to the Northland Workshop. In part 1 of this series, we built the countertop, we built the carcasses and the drawer boxes, and installed the drawer boxes. In this part, we're doing all the finishing touches. We're going to make the drawer fronts and install them for the drawers. We're going to make this little adjustable stop that rides in this track, along with a door and a pull-out tray for the mortiser, and finally, what every shop needs, a nice roll-out scrap bin to put all your offcuts in. So let's get started. The door for the mortising machine compartment is nothing more than a piece of 3/4 inch plywood with hinges on it. So I'm going to start by ripping it to size on the table saw. And now I'll just cross cut it on the radial arm saw. I've decided to use these concealed cup hinges for the door for the mortising machine. And if you've never used these cup hinges before, they look pretty intimidating because you have to drill a big hole for the cup, you've got to drill pilot holes for the screws, and it all has to be a certain distance away from the edge of the door. Well, it's actually not that bad if you have a jig. And there's several out on the market. This one happens to be an all-in-one jig, so it drills the hole for the cup and the pilot holes all with one setting. You'll see it's got turn knobs that adjust the offset from the edge of the big hole to the door. That will be set by the manufacturer of the hinge itself. They'll tell you what that distance is. You simply turn these knobs until it reads the same value as the hinge. Once it's in place, it's got a scale along the top so you can set it the center of the hinge a certain distance from the edge of the door. In this case, I'm going with the full 4 inches, and then you simply clamp it down. Now to drill the big hole, it has a Forstner bit that's a 35mm bit because that's the size hole these things take. And it's got this little plastic drill guide to help hold it straight up and down, and it also sets the depth of the hole. To use it, you simply line it up in the jig and it locks in place, and now I can just drill the hole. Now I don't want to unclamp this jig just yet, so I'm going to turn this, take away the big bit, and while it's still in place, use a 1/16 inch bit in the little pilot holes for the screws. There, now we can remove the jig, and we have a perfect hole for the cup hinge every time. Now I can go ahead and install the hinge. The hinges come with a paper template to tell you where to drill the holes in the cabinet side, but you can also buy jigs that will line it up for you. Now you'll notice that this jig has 2 sets of holes. That's because this jig actually goes to a different model of hinge that I've used in the past. And instead of buying a new jig for this model hinge, I decided to just re-drill the holes to line up with the paper template that was supplied with this hinge. So what you do is you line up the center line in the jig with the center line of where the hinge needs to go, and then you use a self-centering bit to drill the pilot hole. Again, it takes all the guesswork out of it. The door looks great and it works great, but there's one slight issue. And this is why I put the door on before making the slide out tray. And the issue is this: concealed cup hinges stick out into the cabinet space when they're open. That's just the way they work. And because of that, if I had put the drawer slide directly on the side of the cabinet, it would be trapped in here. I wouldn't be able to use the slide out tray. So to get around that, I've made a 3/4 inch thick spacer that I'm going to put on here, and I'm going to mount the drawer slide to that. By putting the drawer slide on this, I'll be able to have it slide in and out past this door. I'll make the rabbet for the plywood in 2 passes on the table saw. Now I want to set the blade so it's the height of a 1/2 inch piece of plywood. I want to set it so that way it's exactly 1/2 inch away from the fence. Now I can complete the notch. I've tipped the blade on the rail arm saw to 45 degrees, so now I'll just miter the pieces with it. Now it's time to start assembling the pull-out shelf. And for the frame, it's just going to be glue and some brads in the mitered corners. It's really the piece of plywood getting glued down that's going to add the strength to it. Now I want to put glue in the rabbet that'll receive the piece of plywood. And the piece of plywood, you're going to notice, is a little bit smaller than the rabbet. That's because I had a piece of plywood that was 14 inches wide, and the size of the rabbet is actually 14 5/16 wide. Well, being a shop project, I really didn't want to let this piece of plywood go to waste. So I decided that I would just use it, and then I've got a little filler strip I cut to fill in the gap on the side. Norm's not the only Yankee in New England. To install the drawer fronts, I took a paint stir and I cut it in half. That gives me an 1/8 inch spacer for the top of the drawer front and a spacer for the side of the drawer front. Now what I can do is push it up against the previous drawer front and slide it up against the mortising machine door and just eyeball it to make sure everything is uniform. now I can go ahead and nail it in place with some 1-inch brads. Now that should hold it well enough that I can slide the drawer out and put some clamps on it. Now I can permanently attach it with some 1-inch screws from the back side. It's kind of difficult trying to lay out where the holes for these drawer pulls are supposed to go and get them consistent on each drawer. So what I did is I made this little jig out of 3 pieces of scrap plywood, and I put a center line on it that corresponds to the center between the 2 mounting holes for the drawer pull. All I have to do is mark the center line on the drawer, line up this jig, and I can go ahead and drill for the handle. With the holes drilled, I can go ahead and attach the drawer pull. I'm cutting some biscuit slots in this plywood edge that is the end panel for the compartment that's going to have the scrap bin. The issue is, as I roll the scrap bin in and out, if I hit this edge, I'm going to chip out the plywood veneer. Also, the plywood edge is kind of unsightly. So what I did is I ripped down a strip of maple and I cut corresponding biscuit slots in it. Now I'll be able to use some biscuits and glue to hold this thing in place, and the maple will protect the plywood edge. If you use biscuits as much as I use biscuits, you've probably noticed that biscuit slots are a pain to try and spread glue in. Well, when I was at my woodworking specialty shop the other week, I noticed that they had this thing. It's a glue bottle kit that has a head shaped like a biscuit that is specifically designed for spreading glue in biscuit holes. And I gotta say, it works pretty well. And I'm just going to nail it in place with a couple 1.5-inch brads. I'm using my little dovetail saw to cut some hardwood runners to go in the stop block. So the stop block started out as a little scrap piece of plywood that I routed 2 45-degree chamfers on. That way, that'll act as the little space for the sawdust when I butt the wood up to it. On the bottom, I cut a groove in it that fit these little hardwood runners. These little hardwood runners are what will go in the T-track to keep it from twisting side to side. Finally, there's a hole in the middle of it for a 1/4-inch bolt that will be what actually clamps it to the T-track. At this point, I can put a little bit of glue in the groove, a little bit on the hardwood runner, push it into place. I want to wait for the glue to start to set up before I scrape it out of the corner. That way it just kind of peels out of there. So while this thing sits in the clamps, we can go and start working on the knob for the stop block. I've cut out both the little spacer and most of the knob for the stop block, and the bandsaw doesn't give me a real good cut, so now I'm going to sand it to the line using my disc sander. Right now I'm in the process of chiseling out a mortise for this nut to sit in. Then I'll epoxy it in place with some 2-part epoxy. Now it's time to assemble the knob, and I've put the bolt in it so that way everything stays lined up. What I'm going to do is just put a little bit of glue on the spacer. Doesn't have to be very much. And then that's going to go up against the knob portion. And then I have 2 pre-drilled holes in it. Those will be for some drywall screws. That'll make it so I don't have to clamp it while the glue dries. So I've mixed up a small batch of epoxy. What I'm going to do is just coat it on the outside of the nut. I don't want to get any underneath it because I really don't want this to get on the threads of the bolt. Now all I gotta do is just get it down into its mortise, and there. Now I can just clean up the excess. Here we have the 3 parts to the stop block. The toilet flange bolt, the stop block body, and the locking knob. The way this works is if I come down to the far end of the T-track, you'll notice that there's an extra long slot right here. That's so I can insert the toilet flange bolt in place. Then I drop the stop block body itself onto the toilet flange bolt. Finally, I take the knob and a couple turns, it's locked in place. If I want to move it somewhere else, all I do, give it a couple turns and it slides back and forth. Each side of the scrap bin gets a 45-degree angle cut on it to make it a little easier to throw the scraps in the bin when it's under the workbench. And to do that, I've clamped both sides together and I've tipped my radial arm saw to 45 degrees so I can make both cuts at the exact same time. The bottom of the scrap bin is going to get inserted into a dado that's in the sides, the front, and the back of the scrap bin. So to cut that dado, I'm setting up the dado head in my table saw. And this is a stacked dado head, so it's a series of cutters. 2 blades with lots of teeth on them go on the outside. This goes on the outside. Then, because the plywood is slightly undersized, I need to use a series of these brass shims. Then I can put a chipper, which is one of the inner cutters, in. It has a lot fewer teeth, and you simply line up its teeth into these little gaps. You don't want this tooth to hit that tooth because the carbide is brittle and it could break. Now I need another brass shim, and I can put a slightly smaller chipper on. Again, making sure the teeth aren't hitting each other. And finally, I can put the outer blade on. The nice thing about the dado head is with the combination of chippers and shims available, I can make it any width I want for a perfect fit on the plywood. The other thing I like to do is, once I run a couple test pieces and I find that this combination of chippers and shims gives me the fit I want for the piece of plywood I'm using, I like to write it down, so that way next time I don't have to go through the trial and error process of figuring out the combination of blades and shims. I need to cut a rabbet in the front and back of the scrap bin, and to do that I've left the height of the dado blade alone, but I've widened it just a little bit, and I've installed the sacrificial fence over the metal fence. That way I can bury part of the dado head in the fence and not risk damaging the factory fence. Now I can cut the rabbet. It's time to start assembling the scrap bin, and I've put glue in the dados and the rabbets, and now it's just put it together like a puzzle piece. The scrap bin is going to be on a pair of fixed casters, but if I was to just screw the casters into the 1/2 inch thick bottom, I'm afraid the screws would pull out because there's just not enough material there. So I've cut these little spacer blocks out of some scrap 3/4 inch plywood, and I'm going to glue and screw these in place. That'll allow me 1 1/4 inch worth of material to attach these casters to. You'll notice that I'm driving these screws in kind of an odd location. The reason for that is I want to make sure that the screw holes for the casters don't interfere with these screws. I'm using a piece of plywood as a support just to hold the caster in place, and I want to have the edges of the mounting bracket parallel to the side of the scrap bin, so that way this thing tracks correctly. Now I'm just going to lay out for the screw holes. And now I'm just securing it with some 1-inch panhead screws. I need to cut out some feet for the front of the scrap bin. It has the 2 fixed casters in the back and just 2 feet in the front, so that's what I'm doing on the bandsaw. I'm going to cut to the line and then sand it down smooth. Now I can sand it to the line using the belt sander. I'm going to use pocket hole screws to attach the feet to the scrap bin. And because this is 1/2 inch thick plywood, I'm using the micro drill guide. The first step in assembling the feet is to glue and staple the 2 parts of the foot together. And now with a little bit of glue on the foot, I can go ahead and clamp this thing in place. And it's important that I get both faces lined up, the one on the side and the one on the front of the scrap bin. And with that in place, I can go ahead and drive in the screws. The side in place, I can move the clamp to the front edge, clamp it in, and drive those screws. And just like with the drawers, because this is 1/2 inch plywood, I'm using the 1-inch panhead screws. Finally, I'm going to install a glue block just to help reinforce this whole corner. And that's going to get stapled in from the outside of the foot. And there's the scrap bin in its new home. There's some scraps for the scrap bin. And I would say this project is done.